Usually when we talk about a field like nuclear physics, there's this expectation of pure cold objectivity.
Right, it's just math.
Exactly. You split the atom, you measure the isotopes, and the math is the math. It's supposed to be binary.
You calculate the decay heat removal rate, and the Geiger counter just clicks.
Yeah, it's clean. But then you step into the world of modern energy politics, and suddenly that pristine laboratory is, honestly, it's a battleground.
It really is.
They're no longer just looking at protons and neutrons. You're looking at a deeply contested ideological landscape.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, we like things in the hard sciences to be perfectly categorized, right? Free from human messy emotions.
That's for sure.
But right now, we are seeing the laws of thermodynamics just colliding head-on with the laws of culture.
And that collision is exactly what we're exploring today.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Before we even jump into you, the listener tuning in, please take a second right now to like and subscribe to the show.
Yeah, it really helps us out. It really does.
Yeah.
It helps us bring you these extensive breakdowns. And I want to get this right out of the gate. If you are part of the men's rights communities, if you identify with the red-pilled manosphere, or honestly, if you simply want to deeply understand the history of our institutions before they were supposedly captured by feminists and Marxists, today's deep dive is an absolute must-listen.
It is quite the read.
We're reviewing an explosive, ultra-long, and incredibly incisive new ebook titled Mastering Nuclear Energy, The Physics and History of Harnessing the Atom by Conrad Riker, published in 2025.
Just this past year, yeah.
Do yourself a favor right now and check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book, and make sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
It is a massive, highly provocative text. I mean, it covers everything from the Manhattan Project to modern divorce courts, all through this lens of nuclear engineering.
Exactly. And because of the nature of this text, we have a very specific mission today. Today's source material contains highly politically charged content. We want to make it absolutely clear to you, the listener, that we are not taking sides or endorsing the viewpoints presented in this book.
We are just the messengers here.
Yes. Our goal is to impartially report on the content provided and convey the original ideas exactly as the author intended, giving you a front row seat to the arguments shaping this movement. So to start us off, can you give us a high-level overview of Riker's core thesis? What is he actually arguing here?
So at its core, Riker's thesis is that the history of nuclear physics is inherently and inextricably tied to evolutionary biology.
Okay.
Yeah. Riker argues that modern bureaucratic and what he terms woke cultural shifts are not just political annoyances. He claims they are actively sabotaging human energy independence.
Wow, so he's drawing a direct line there.
Absolutely. To Riker, a nuclear reactor isn't just a machine. He views it as a physical manifestation of masculine drive, of hierarchy, and extreme risk-taking.
Okay, let's unpack this, because he starts his argument by taking us right back to the birth of the atomic age, specifically the Manhattan Project.
Right, the big one.
But he doesn't just look at this as a scientific achievement. He frames it entirely around gender and risk. He points out that this was a 97% male workforce that managed to build a city-killing device from scratch in exactly 27 months.
Yes, Riker uses the Manhattan Project as his baseline for what he calls masculine calibration. And he tells this incredible anecdote about the physicist Enrico Fermi to sort of illustrate his point.
Oh, the betting story.
Yeah, so in 1942, during the creation of Chicago Pile 1, which was the world's first artificial nuclear reactor, Fermi casually bet his colleagues $10 that his uranium pile wouldn't accidentally incinerate the city of Chicago.
Wait, I want to pause right there, because for someone not steeped in nuclear history, that sounds like a joke. Was he actually serious? Was there a real risk of incinerating Chicago?
I mean, it was a very real unknown frontier. Chicago Pile 1 was built on a squash court under the University of Chicago's football stadium.
Under a football stadium. That is just, it's insane to think about today.
Right. They were piling up thousands of graphite bricks and uranium pellets. They had no modern computer simulations. They were relying on slide rules and raw intellect to calculate the neutron multiplication factor.
So what was the safety mechanism if the math was wrong?
Well, for safety, they literally had a guy named Norman Hilberry standing by with an axe.
With an axe?
An actual axe. He was ready to chop a rope that would drop cadmium control rods into the pile to stop the reaction if it went out of control.
An axe and a rope. That was the emergency backup system for the first nuclear reactor.
Exactly. And when the Geiger counters clicked into a sustained roar, indicating a self-sustaining chain reaction, Fermi didn't panic. He just calmly monitored the instruments, announced that the reaction was self-sustaining, and he collected his cash.
Incredible.
And Riker uses this to argue that these men weren't just tolerating risk, they were energized by it.
It sounds like reckless gambling to a modern ear, though. Like if you tried to build a reactor under a football stadium today, you'd have the FBI, the EPA, and the NRC swarming the place in hazmat suits before you laid the first brick.
Oh, absolutely. But Riker argues Fermi's bet wasn't reckless at all. He frames this as men thriving under risk hierarchies. He pulls heavily from evolutionary psychology here.
How so?
Well, he claims that for 2 million years, men evolved to hunt megafauna alone to navigate extreme physical danger and outwit rival tribes.
Right, the hunter-gatherer dynamic.
Yes. And this evolutionary pressure, according to Riker, built a male brain that is uniquely suited to hyper-focusing on high-stakes, dangerous tasks where failure means immediate death.
He actually uses a really specific, highly technical metaphor for this in the book. He claims that the male brain is built to hyper-focus, like uranium-235 absorbing neutrons, while female minds are evolutionarily wired to scatter like moderation rods.
That's the quote, yeah.
Now, for those of us who aren't nuclear engineers, can you explain what a moderation rod actually does in a reactor? Because I want to understand how Riker is mapping this biology onto the physics.
Absolutely. So inside a reactor, you have uranium-235, which is a highly unstable isotope. When a neutron hits a U-235 nucleus, it splits,
Releasing energy.
releasing immense energy and more neutrons. This is the chain reaction. However, the neutrons that come flying out of that split are moving incredibly fast.
Okay.
They are actually moving too fast to easily hit another U-235 nucleus. They need to be slowed down to increase the probability of a collision.
So they need to be slowed down to actually cause the next reaction.
Right. And that slowing down process is called moderation. Reactors use moderators like graphite or heavy water, and they also use control rods made of materials like boron or cadmium, which absorb neutrons entirely to keep the reaction from spiraling out of control.
Okay, see.
So in physics, moderation and control rods scatter or absorb the energy to keep the system stable and safe.
Okay, so applying Riker's metaphor, he's saying the male mind is like the uranium, highly concentrated explosive driving the reaction forward, and he's equating the female mind to the moderator, which exists to slow things down, absorb the energy, and prioritize safety.
Precisely. Evolutionary psychology suggests women evolved to gather collaboratively, focusing on community risk mitigation and safety.
Right.
Riker argues that this collaborative safety-first mindset, the moderator, is entirely antithetical to the kind of obsessive, solitary, explosive focus required to split the atom or build a new civilization. He believes that to achieve massive technological leaps, you need the raw, unmoderated reaction.
I have to say, if we push back on that metaphor purely from a physics standpoint, if you remove the moderator and the control rods from a reactor, you don't get unlimited clean energy. You get Chernobyl. The system blows itself apart.
And Riker actually embraces that. He does. He argues that true progress requires the acceptance of explosive failure. He believes modern society is so terrified of a meltdown, both literally and socially, that it has shoved too many moderation rods into the engine of progress, bringing the reaction to a complete halt.
Wow. And he gives some historical examples to back up this idea of the solitary, hyper-focused male mind, right? Like James Chadwick.
Yes. Chadwick discovered the neutron in 1932, and Riker points out that Chadwick didn't work with a committee or a focus group. Discovering the neutron was incredibly difficult because, unlike protons or electrons, neutrons have no electrical charge.
So they're invisible to standard tools.
Exactly. You can't just detect them with the standard electromagnetic field. So Chadwick essentially locked himself in a lab for 14-hour stretches, working entirely alone, bombarding beryllium with alpha particles until he mathematically proved the neutron's existence.
Or Richard Feynman, who Riker mentions was calculating pi to 759 decimal places just for fun while working on the atomic bomb.
Right, just as a side hobby.
Riker's painting a picture of these obsessive, highly competitive, almost antisocial lone wolves. But I have to admit, I'm a bit confused here. How does Riker handle the presence of prominent female scientists in this exact same era? I mean, Marie Curie is arguably one of the most famous physicists of all time. She literally coined the term radioactivity.
Well, Riker attacks those examples head-on, arguing they are essentially feminist myth-making.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, with Marie Curie, he points out that she won her first Nobel Prize only after marrying Pierre Curie, who Riker claims literally gifted her half of his research to elevate her status.
He actually says that.
He does, and he notes her second Nobel Prize came after Pierre's death, achieved by heavily collaborating with Pierre's male protege.
Okay, that is a massive dismissal of her work. What about someone like Lise Meitner? She was instrumental in discovering nuclear fission.
Riker dismisses her as well. He claims that Meitner merely discovered nuclear fission from a safe Swedish exile completely removed from the physical risk of the laboratory, while her male colleagues, like Otto Hahn, were the ones actually in the lab handling the dangerous uranium pellets.
So he's drawing a line between the theoretical and the physical danger.
Exactly. Riker argues that doing the math from a safe distance is fundamentally different from taking on the physical risk of handling fissile material.
It's like he views these early male physicists as solitary snipers, operating deep behind enemy lines, taking on all the lethal risks themselves. And he's contrasting that lone sniper mentality with the modern era, which he sees as a massive bureaucratic committee where everyone is just talking over each other in a safe briefing room.
That analogy perfectly captures his argument. He states flatly that physical laws do not bend to gender quotas. He says that the data roars louder than any woke mob, that men built the nuclear age alone because weakness meant annihilation and testosterone meant triumph. He even points to the Soviet RBMK reactors, which is the exact type of reactor that failed at Chernobyl.
Wait, he uses Chernobyl as a positive example. How does he justify that?
Well, he acknowledges their catastrophic design flaws, but he notes that from a pure construction and deployment standpoint, they were built twice as fast as American designs.
Because of less red tape?
Because the Soviets used all-male, hyper-hierarchical teams that didn't stop to, in his words, check their privilege mid-welding. To Riker, the speed of implementation was a triumph of unmoderated masculine drive, even if the state's engineering ultimately failed.
Okay, so Riker establishes this baseline that the atomic age was birthed by hyper-focused, risk-taking, solitary men. Because men can no longer build in this unconstrained way in the public sphere, how does Riker explain the transition into the modern era? What is his causal link between the end of that golden age and the current state of nuclear energy where it takes 3 decades just to get a single plant online?
This brings us to the core of his critique on modern institutions. Riker argues that Western academia, regulatory bodies like the NRC, and the broader energy sectors have been entirely captured by feminist dogma and a Marxist-style bureaucracy. He believes this capture is the direct cause of our stalled technological progress. According to Riker, this bureaucracy prioritizes emotional feelings over actual physical safety.
And the examples he pulls from the book to illustrate this bureaucratic rot are honestly startling. He cites a case from 2023 where a Canadian reactor engineer was slapped with a $50,000 fine.
Yeah, that one is unbelievable.
Do you know what his crime was? He wrote the word mankind in a safety report instead of humankind.
And what Riker emphasizes is the context of that report. The report was detailing a fissile material leak.
Right, an actual physical emergency.
Yeah.
For our listeners, why is a fissile material leak such a massive deal?
A fissile material leak means radioactive isotopes. Materials that emit ionizing radiation are escaping their containment. If inhaled or ingested by workers, or if it leaches into the local water table, it alters human DNA and causes cellular death or cancer.
So it's basically the worst case scenario.
It is the absolute highest priority safety hazard in a plant. But Riker points out that the diversity, equity, and inclusion commissars at the plant were more concerned with the linguistic incorrectness of the word mankind than the fact that radioactive water was pooling on the floor.
It perfectly highlights what Riker calls safetyism. He argues that modern HR departments have created this illusion of safety, a safety theater. They prioritize preventing hurt feelings over preventing actual hurt bodies, which ironically makes the physical energy grids vastly more fragile.
He brings up another staggering example at the Vogtle plant in Georgia.
Oh, the big expansion project.
Right, the Vogtle expansion is one of the only new nuclear projects in the U.S. in recent decades, and it's notoriously over budget and delayed. According to Riker's research crews, they're spent 3 weeks filing 2,147 separate diversity and equity compliance forms before they were cleared to repair a cracked coolant pipe.
3 weeks of paperwork just to touch a pipe. And again, let's break down the mechanics here. Why is a cracked coolant pipe a critical failure point?
Well, in a pressurized water reactor, the coolant, which is usually highly purified water, is pumped through the reactor core to carry away the intense heat generated by fission.
Okay.
Even after a reactor is scrammed or shut down, the radioactive decay of the fuel continues to generate massive amounts of heat. This is called decay heat. If the coolant pipe leaks and the water level drops, that decay heat can't be removed.
And then what happens?
The fuel rods will eventually melt through their containment vessels, a literal meltdown, so time is of the essence. But Riker states that by the time the HR paperwork cleared at Vogtle, the leak had doubled in size, vastly increasing the physical danger to the crew.
He compares this Western red tape directly to Eastern efficiency, to show just how far the West has fallen. It's a stark contrast in the data.
Very stark. Riker notes the United States now spends 40% of its total nuclear budgets on regulatory, paperwork, environmental impact studies, and compliance audits.
40%, wow.
Compare that to China, which spends just 10% on paperwork. He highlights China's Hualong 1 reactor. It's a state-of-the-art pressurized water reactor, and China built it in just 5.2 years. And Riker specifically notes it was built by a construction crew that was 98% male, working around the clock without DEI seminars.
Meanwhile, Western projects are drowning in what he calls inclusive red tape.
Exactly.
And it's not just the U.S. that he targets. He highlights an incredibly absurd situation in Sweden. According to Riker's Sweden's Vattenfall thorium project, which was supposed to be, this next-generation reactor was completely scrapped. And the reason?
Yeah.
Because equity auditors demanded a gender-balanced neutron flux distribution.
Yeah.
I have to stop here. What in the world is a neutron flux distribution, and how can it be gender-balanced?
It can't. That's Riker's entire point.
Right.
In reactor physics, neutron flux simply refers to the density and speed of neutrons passing through a specific area inside the reactor core at any given time.
Right, it's just math.
It is a purely mathematical physical measurement used to ensure the core is burning fuel evenly and safely. Neutrons are subatomic particles. They do not have a biological sex. They don't have genders.
So it's a literal category error in physics.
Exactly. But Riker argues that the equity auditors who had no background in nuclear engineering saw the word distribution and accused the physicists of creating a patriarchal hierarchy within the reactor core itself.
You're kidding.
No. He claims the Swedes actually fired their lead physicist and replaced him with a diversity coordinator whose previous job was at a feminist knitting collective. And as a result, that multi-million-dollar thorium reactor project was shelved, and it now powers exactly 0 homes.
He also goes after modern academia, aggressively tracking where this mindset originates. He mentions a course at Stanford University called Decolonizing Reactor Safety. In this course, a professor allegedly claimed that Newtonian physics and the very concept of gravity's hegemony reflects colonial power structures.
It's hard to even process that.
Let that sink in. Riker's looking at this and asking the obvious question, how can you possibly build a 100 million degree fusion reactor when the people in charge of the math think gravity is just a colonial construct?
It's a complete detachment from physical reality, according to Riker. And what's fascinating here is how he connects this bureaucratic capture of nuclear energy to the broader mainstream green energy movement. He doesn't just see solar and wind power as technologically inefficient, he views the entire green energy movement as a matriarchal performance art.
A matriarchal performance art. That is quite the phrase.
He argues that green energy like solar panels and wind turbines are essentially participation trophies for a society that has become completely allergic to the excellence and danger required for nuclear power. He details the firing of Dr. Lars Bergström, a highly respected Swedish climatologist.
What happened there?
Well, in 2021, Dr. Bergström published a rigorous peer-reviewed paper showing exactly how crucial nuclear power is for actually slashing carbon emissions and meeting climate goals.
Which, if you actually care about carbon emissions, is objectively true. Nuclear produces virtually 0 greenhouse gases during operation.
Right. But because his data contradicted the renewables-only orthodoxy pushed by green NGOs, he was fired from his university post. Riker points out the intense hypocrisy of activists who scream follow the science but suddenly develop amnesia the second uranium is brought up.
Because public policy in the energy sector is increasingly driven by ideology rather than engineering, Riker uses Germany's Energiewende, their massive transition to renewable energy, as the ultimate cautionary tale, right?
Yes. After the Fukushima disaster in Japan, Germany panicked. To appease green activists, they shuttered their perfectly functional, highly safe nuclear reactors. They then spent a staggering $580 billion on wind and solar infrastructure.
$500 billion.
But Riker zeroes in on the 2021 Dunkelflaut.
The Dunkelflaut, I love that word. It translates to the dark doldrums, right?
Exactly. It's a weather phenomenon in Europe where you have prolonged periods of dark, cloudy skies and 0 wind. When the Dunkelflaut hit, Germany's massive $580 billion renewable grid failed completely. Solar couldn't generate power because it was dark, and wind couldn't generate power because the air was still. They lost all their baseload generation.
And baseload generation is the absolute minimum amount of power needed to keep a country's grid from collapsing, like hospitals running traffic lights, working heating systems on.
Right. So to prevent a catastrophic blackout, Germany was forced to buy massive amounts of Russian natural gas and fire up their old, dirty coal plants, completely spiking their carbon emissions.
The irony is painful.
Riker contrasts this utter failure with France. France ignored the green activists and maintained a robust grid powered by 56 standardized nuclear reactors. During that same weather crisis, France was completely fine and was actually dominating the region by exporting their surplus nuclear energy to neighboring countries.
He really hammers home the contrast in how these different energy sectors react to an actual crisis. He talks about the Texas deep freeze a few years ago. The state's power grid failed miserably, and Riker points out that the solar farms were literally buried in snow and completely useless.
Yeah, I remember that.
During that crisis, a TikTok user named Reactor Chad went viral. He was a guy working at the South Texas Project nuclear plant, and he posted a video mocking the frozen solar panels while his nuclear plant just kept pumping out gigawatts of power through the blizzard.
And that gets into the physics again. Solar panels rely on unobstructed sunlight, which snow blocks. But a nuclear reactor generates massive amounts of internal heat through fission. The cold weather outside actually makes the thermodynamic efficiency of a nuclear plant slightly better because it relies on a temperature differential to spin the steam turbines.
Riker contrasts that fragility of the green grid with the ultimate stoicism of the Fukushima 50 in Japan.
Yes, and this is a crucial emotional anchor for his argument. When the tsunami hit the Fukushima Daiichi plant, it knocked out the backup diesel generators needed to pump coolant. The reactors were melting down.
Just a total nightmare scenario.
The Fukushima 50 were a group of male engineers who willingly stayed behind. They marched into highly radioactive, pitch-black buildings, wading through contaminated water, manually turning heavy mechanical valves to vent explosive hydrogen gas and pump seawater into the cooling pools to save their people, knowing they were taking on lethal doses of radiation.
To Riker, that is the pure essence of masculine energy versus estrogen-driven policy. He drops a statistic that 89% of the leaders of anti-nuclear NGOs, the people shutting down these plants, are women.
He contrasts that with the male-dominated engineering teams that actually strap on the hazmat suits and keep the lights on during a crisis. He argues broadly that when women complain, grids die, but when men lead, reactors rise.
Which sets up his next major argument perfectly. Because Riker establishes that the public sphere, the energy grid academia, the regulatory bodies, is paralyzed by this safetyism and bureaucratic rod. And because men can no longer build in the public sphere, Riker argues they are retreating to the private sphere.
Huh?
But there, he claims they hit an entirely different kind of trap: modern marriage.
Right, if you can't build a reactor, you try to build a family. But Riker argues the family court system is just as captured as the NRC. He introduces this concept of the marriage industrial complex, and his claims here are incredibly provocative.
They really are.
He views modern divorce courts as explicit mechanisms designed to fund the oppression of men, using the wealth generated by male labor and STEM careers to subsidize what he views as frivolous feminist endeavors.
He tells a wild, highly detailed story about a nuclear engineer in Nevada to illustrate this. This engineer went through a brutal divorce and decided to hide $3.2 million in uranium trust royalties in a complex offshore account to actively dodge alimony payments.
Okay, wait. How does a uranium trust royalty actually work legally? How do you hide $3 million in uranium?
So in the nuclear industry, you can invest in holding companies like trusts that buy physical uranium yellowcake and store it in secure facilities in places like Canada or Kazakhstan, waiting for the price to go up.
Oh, I see.
Or you own the mineral royalty rights to a specific patch of land being mined. Because these assets are highly specialized, illiquid, and often held in foreign jurisdictions with complex international mining laws, they're incredibly difficult for a domestic family court judge in Nevada to subpoena or seize.
But the judge eventually found out right, because Riker says the engineer was jailed for contempt of court.
He was. And Riker makes sure to point out that this engineer served more time in a maximum security cell than most violent criminals do in that state. And the punchline, or the tragedy, depending on how you look at it, is where the money went when the ex-wife finally got her hands on it. She allegedly funneled the uranium money into a feminist art therapy collective in California that specialized in smashing vagina-shaped pottery as a form of trauma healing.
It sounds made up, but Riker pairs that with the story of Dr. Robert Matthews, an MIT-trained reactor designer. Matthews is allegedly paying $40,000 a month in alimony.
40 grand a month.
40 grand a month. And Riker claims this money doesn't go to his children's STEM tutors or college funds. Instead, it bankrolls his ex-wife's extravagant healing retreats where divorced women gather to smash phallic ice sculptures with sledgehammers.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Riker isn't just relying on extreme anecdotes. He actually attempts to run the macroeconomic numbers on this cultural shift. He introduces a metric he calls the SIMP index.
The SIMP index. It's Riker's calculation of massively misallocated male resources. He points out that in the year 2023, men collectively spent $117 billion on the platform OnlyFans.
That's just an unfathomable amount of money.
Right, and Riker calculates that this exact amount of money, $117 billion, could have fully funded 13 ITER-scale nuclear fusion projects.
Now, I know fusion is the holy grail of energy, but what exactly is an ITER-scale project, and why does it cost so much?
ITER is an international nuclear fusion research and engineering mega project being built in France. Unlike fission, which splits heavy atoms, fusion forces light atoms like hydrogen to fuse together, the exact process that powers the sun.
Star power on Earth.
Yes. To do this on Earth, you have to build a machine called a tokamak. It uses massive, incredibly complex toroidal magnetic fields, essentially giant donut-shaped magnets, to contain a plasma that is heated to 150 million degrees Celsius.
150 million. That's hotter than the core of the sun.
Much hotter. If the plasma touches the walls of the machine, it instantly cools and the reaction stops. The engineering precision required to contain a star in a magnetic bottle is why it costs tens of billions of dollars.
So Riker is arguing that this is a catastrophic tax on male potential. He says that if that $117 billion of dopamine-driven capital were redirected from digital harems and OnlyFans subscriptions into toroidal magnetic fields and tokamak engineering, humanity would have unlimited, virtually free, clean energy.
We could colonize the solar system.
Exactly. We could colonize the solar system, but instead, men are buying bathwater.
It's a blistering framing. He's saying that modern marriage and modern dating are essentially a liability swap. Riker cites census data and court records claiming that men assume 93% of the financial risk in a marriage.
93%.
The man takes on the risk of losing half his assets, his future income, and access to his children, while the woman is financially incentivized to initiate the divorce.
Which explains the viral Tinder bio he mentions in the book. This is one of my favorite details. He talks about a 34-year-old nuclear engineer named Carl, whose Tinder bio simply read, "Swipe left if you believe in 50-50 splits or basic physics."
And the rationale behind Carl's bio perfectly encapsulates Riker's entire worldview. Carl is applying the first and second laws of thermodynamics to modern dating.
Exactly. The analogy works perfectly. In thermodynamics, you cannot create free energy out of nowhere. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred.
Right.
Riker's arguing that feminists demand equality in the workplace, but then expect a massive transfer of energy, a 50-50 split of a man's much higher income and labor in divorce court. You can't demand free lifestyle subsidies while claiming to be an independent equal system. To Riker, that is an equality that is socialist extraction of male labor.
So because the public sphere is ruined by bureaucracy and the private sphere is rigged by family courts, what is Riker's tactical advice to his male readers? Because he doesn't just complain, he offers a blueprint for what he calls nuclear divorce shields.
Right. He advises men to structure their careers and their assets like a control rod in a reactor, absorbing the risk and shutting down the extraction process. He advocates for using offshore LLCs, complex corporate structures, and specifically holding assets in those uranium royalties we talked about earlier.
And the reason he specifically recommends international mining royalties is because they trigger what he calls the feminist bureaucracy filter.
The feminist bureaucracy filter. Explain how that mechanism actually works in a legal setting.
It's based on the idea that modern family law attorneys are used to easy prey. They want liquid assets like 401ks, house equity, standard bank accounts.
The standard stuff.
Right. If a man places his wealth in a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, which in turn owns a holding company in Delaware, which in turn owns the mineral rights to a uranium vein in Saskatchewan, it requires an immense amount of legal and technical labor to untangle.
I'm getting a headache just thinking about the paperwork.
Riker argues that most divorce attorneys are intellectually lazy and will simply give up rather than try to litigate international nuclear regulatory law. By making the assets as complex and esoteric as atomic physics, men create an impenetrable shield around their labor.
He also mentions these atomic monasteries popping up in Texas, which sound incredible.
Yeah.
These are tax-free cooperatives entirely off the grid where groups of high-income single men buy vast tracts of land. They share high-end lab equipment pool, their legal defense funds, and enforce a strict no estrogen policy on the property.
It's a complete physical opt-out of traditional society.
If we look at the causal chain here from protecting assets to building new physical frontiers, Rucker is mapping out the rise of an entirely new subculture. He calls the current state of mainstream manhood the beta male epidemic, where men are socially conditioned to be soft, to prioritize emotional labor, and to apologize for their ambition.
But he sees a massive backlash brewing in these atomic monasteries, which he terms atomic libertarianism.
And this is where the book really shifts gears from a critique of the past into a wild, almost sci-fi vision of the future. Riker envisions a world of rogue, decentralized, purely male-led atomic innovation. He introduces us to the uranium cowboys of West Texas.
Uranium cowboys.
These are guys live streaming their defiance to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, standing out in the desert next to a glowing fuel rod with a massive billboard that just reads, "Come and take it."
It is a radical, almost terrifying vision of absolute personal sovereignty. Riker makes a philosophical argument that relying on the national energy grid is a form of neo-feudalism.
Neo-feudalism.
Yeah,
Because you are dependent on the lord of the manor or the state for your basic survival.
exactly. Every kilowatt hour you buy from the state grid makes you a serf to their regulations, their taxes, and their ESG quotas. If you anger the state, they can simply flip a switch and freeze you out. But if you own a microreactor on your own land, you become a lord of your own domain. You are entirely self-sufficient.
It reminds me of the shift from mainframe computing to personal computers in the 1980s. Back then, computing power was centralized in massive IBM mainframes, controlled by corporations or the military.
Right, you couldn't just have one.
If you wanted to compute, you had to ask permission. But when the PC was invented, that power was decentralized to the individual desk. It shifted the entire balance of power in society. Riker is arguing for the exact same decentralized revolution, but with nuclear energy instead of microchips.
That is a brilliant analogy, and it's exactly what Riker is prophesying. And he points out how younger generations are responding to this concept. Gen Z men are increasingly bypassing traditional institutions like academia and standard corporate career paths entirely. They know the system is rigged against them, so they are relying on meme warfare to shift the culture and educate themselves.
He talks about hashtag Atomic Sigma edits on TikTok. These are so funny to picture. They are UFC-style, hyperkinetic, high-energy video edits of engineers doing complex calculus mixed with the footage of Geiger counters, all synced to heavy EDM music.
Yeah, they're intense.
They are aggressively framing reactor design, not as some nerdy academic pursuit, but as the ultimate alpha male flex.
He mentions influencers like @NuclearAlpha69. This is a guy who explains highly complex plutonium cycles and fast breeder reactors using WWE professional wrestling analogies. And Riker notes that young men trust these anonymous creators vastly more than they trust UN bureaucrats or Ivy League professors.
Wait, you mentioned fast breeder reactors. Riker talks about these in the context of Reactor Reef, right?
Yes, Reactor Reef.
He describes Reactor Reef as a libertarian micronation built on a salvaged oil rig out in international waters. And it's powered by smuggled Russian fast breeder reactors. How in the world does a fast breeder reactor work? And how do a bunch of rogue libertarians smuggle one onto an oil rig?
So a fast breeder reactor is a specific type of nuclear reactor that actually creates more fissile material than it consumes.
It creates its own fuel.
Basically, yes. It uses fast neutrons, meaning they aren't slowed down by a moderator, to bombard an isotope like uranium-238. The U-238 absorbs the neutron and decays into plutonium-239, which is highly fissile and can be used as fuel, so the reactor breathes its own fuel as it runs.
That's wild. And the smuggling part.
Well, as for the smuggling, when the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of maritime and submarine nuclear technology went missing or was sold on the black market by unpaid scientists. Riker implies these atomic libertarians are buying up this old, highly efficient Soviet tech, bypassing all international non-proliferation treaties.
Out on an oil rig.
On Reactor Reef, there are no marriage licenses, no ESG diversity quotas, no NRC inspectors, just male engineers pushing the extreme boundaries of physics without asking for permission.
That is insane. And it's not just out in the ocean. There's this great story about a group at MIT who call themselves the Nuclear Bros. According to Riker, they built a functioning miniature reactor in their dorm room using scrap parts they bought on eBay and a $500 research grant.
I know what you're going to ask. How is this physically possible in a dorm room without the NRC kicking the door down?
Yes, because if I try to build an addition on my house, the city inspector's there the next day. How do you build a nuclear reactor in a dorm?
They likely built what's known as a Farnsworth-Hirsch fusor, or a subcritical assembly. A fusor uses an electric field to heat ions to nuclear fusion conditions. It creates actual fusion and produces a measurable neutron flux, but it is not self-sustaining, and it doesn't use highly regulated fissile material like enriched uranium.
So it's technically legal.
It's an incredible feat of engineering for a college student, but legally, because of the specific materials used and the lack of a sustained chain reaction, it exploits a massive loophole in federal regulations.
And the nuclear bros used this dorm reactor to power a popcorn machine. Filmed it and got 5 million views on TikTok in a single day.
While feminist think tanks in Washington publish panicked op-eds calling the stunt radioactive machismo and demanding new legislation to ban amateur physics, the nuclear bros just laughed and kept building.
It's weaponized compliance. They are using the exact letter of the law to mock the spirit of the bureaucracy. Riker also highlights the Brotherhood of Atomic Libertarians in Bozeman, Montana.
Oh yeah, the Bozeman guys.
These guys managed to get their hands on a decommissioned Soviet submarine reactor, and they converted it into a 12-megawatt power plant on their private compound.
A submarine reactor is a highly enriched, incredibly compact pressurized water reactor. It has a massive power density because it has to fit inside a submarine hull. The Brotherhood in Bozeman uses this 12-megawatt plant to heat an enormous private sauna, run a fully functional metal smelter, and most importantly, mine massive amounts of untraceable Bitcoin.
And the best part of that story is the legal maneuvering. When the IRS and federal regulators finally showed up to audit them and shut the reactor down, how did they dodge the agents?
They dodge them by exploiting the very cultural rules that Riker critiques. They legally registered their heavily armed all-male compound as a, quote, non-gendered spiritual collective.
Unbelievable.
By claiming religious exemption and using the language of modern identity politics against the state, they paralyzed the federal agents. The IRS backed off rather than risk a civil rights lawsuit for discriminating against a marginalized spiritual group.
That is absolutely brilliant, Judo. Using the state's own woke rulebook to protect a rogue nuclear reactor, Riker is essentially taking standard environmentalism and tuning it completely on its head. Usually handling dangerous radioactive isotopes is framed as a massive environmental hazard that requires the strictest possible government oversight.
Right.
But Riker frames it as the ultimate crucible. It's not a hazard, it's a test of masculine competence and freedom.
Yeah.
If you can master the atom, you can master your own destiny.
Precisely. Riker argues that the future belongs to those who command energy, not those who command empathy. He sees these decentralized microreactors not just as a technological leap, but as a fundamental political revolution.
A shift in power.
It's about men reclaiming the frontier. But instead of covered wagons and plows, they are using gas centrifuges and neutron moderators. They are carving out pockets of absolute freedom in a world that wants to regulate them into submission.
So to synthesize all of this, Conrad Riker's Mastering Nuclear Energy is a fiercely unapologetic, highly controversial manifesto. He uses the literal physical reality of splitting the atom as a grand metaphor for male sovereignty, for taking massive risks, and for escaping what he views as the suffocating feminized constraints of modern bureaucracy and woke culture.
He argues that the traits that literally built the modern world obsession, rigid hierarchy, extreme risk tolerance, solitary focus, are currently being pathologized by a society that relies entirely on the very energy those traits produce.
Which is a huge paradox.
His ultimate solution is total independence. Build your own reactor, shield your assets in complex offshore trusts, and leave the mainstream grid behind entirely.
It is an incredibly dense, explosive read. It takes concepts of quantum mechanics and weaponizes them for the culture war. Once again, to you, our listener, if you want to explore these arguments in full, and trust me, we barely scratched the surface of the technical data in the book, check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to purchase the ebook Mastering Nuclear Energy.
Definitely worth digging into the actual math he provides.
Also, make sure you follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack for more of his writings. And please take a moment to like and subscribe to this show so we can keep bringing you these deep dives.
We covered a lot of ground today, from the physics of the Manhattan Project to the legal mechanics of offshore alimony shields, but the core theme remains constant: the inescapable relationship between power technology and personal autonomy.
Exactly. And that leaves us with a final lingering thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. We spent this time talking about Riker's vision of atomic anarchists going off the grid, setting up shop on oil rigs and in Montana compounds. But let's extrapolate that idea to its absolute limit. If decentralized microreactors and independent power grids actually become cheap and accessible to the average person, as Riker envisions for the near future, how will that absolute energy independence change the very nature of the social contract between the individual and the state?
That's the real question.
Think about it. The state enforces its laws largely through the threat of cutting you off from the grid, freezing your assets, starving you of resources. But if the government can no longer control the literal power switch in your home, do they lose the power to govern you entirely? It's a fascinating question. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.